Well, welcome back. Hope you guys had a quick 10-minute break, nothing hectic. Not as active as our break was for 10 minutes, that's for sure. On the fly, getting things done.
Yep.
So yeah, I hope the introduction deck set the foundation for the day. The working through the planning, understanding the roles, understanding the personas, where the pieces fit in together. And now we're going to start to climb into those phases.
Yeah, and it helped you to understand, right? There was a comment on there, hey, I didn't understand, I got lost at the end. Well, we kind of expected that, right? We don't expect you to understand all the technologies and slides because we're going to start explaining those over the course of the day.
100%.
Yep.
I think if we climb into the first piece, now really this is going to be on the develop phase. So as traditionally as developers, this is where they meet with business, they understand the requirements, they get a full look and feel of what do I need to create. And they go away into developer land and they start to create their items, their tasks, and they start to work away at making the application. But now we want to take one step back and say, hang on a second, in this planning phase, let's do a bit more. As IT pros, understand what developers are doing, why they're doing it like they are, what capabilities they have available in the tools, on premises and in public cloud, and try and support and align to what they're doing around the application creation. And then step into the actual process of the framework that we've got and see where the IT Pro tools can be quite handy and significant to enable the developers a little bit more. So for the first few slides in this deck now, we're just going to position the actual components that make up the actual phase around repositories, source control, what these words you possibly could hear in the hallways, have heard developers say, what does it actually mean and what are we talking about? So yeah, we click away onto that slide. We'll have a look first at the on-premise piece. So Team Foundation Server, really the management component for Visual Studio, allowing developers to have a central location for various things, whether it be security, whether it be control, whether it be from integration with other products. So on the slide at the moment, you'll see in the dark blue the actual capabilities that Team Foundation Server has provided since really the beginning when it became a mainstream product for Microsoft from a management perspective for developers. So looking at source repos, looking at agile planning, looking at team rooms, as well as test case management. How do I start to build in some test cases that give me a real view before I throw this over the wall and it becomes a live application? So those blue blocks are kind of the capabilities for Team Foundation Server. And over the arch, you'll actually see the components that provide all of those. And now we'll marry those against Visual Studio Online, the actual online service from Microsoft that's there to provide a very similar list of functionalities as those blue capabilities that you see below the arch. So looking at build services, looking at load testing, how do I do continuous deployment to Azure? So all of these little pieces you see on the arches at the moment are the pieces we're going to drill down into. So yes, you might have left a little bit confused at the last session, the last closing slides, but now we're going to start to break those down and expose and show exactly what is happening along the way in developer land, and how as IT pros, when you come from the operations side, can you support them and enable them at the end of the day.
Yeah. I'd like to also be clear real quick. I mean, there's no way we're going to cover all the stuff that's in both of the Team Foundation Server Visual Studio Online because largely a lot of that stuff is not relevant for an operations guy and also just time today, right? You know, you don't need to know about Kanban boards or, you know, filing tickets and bugs and stuff right now today, right? But just to give you an idea, right, like Morgan says, what's the developer's world? What are they dealing with? What are the other things that are around here? Because we will show you some Team Foundation Server, we will show you some Visual Studio Online, but obviously only small capabilities within there.
And really it is about positioning all those pieces. The slides, again, are a takeaway. So you'll see a couple of tables now that we're going to kind of brisk through, but to give you a view of the differences between a centralized repository and a decentralized. What are the pros and cons? Now, these items might not mean much in depth to you, but when you are involved with developers and business in the planning section, you need to understand firstly the language. What are they positioning? Why do they want to store their content in this location? Why are they storing content locally on laptops? What are the reasonings behind that? Because if you understand those components, you can add value to that. So, right, well, instead of storing code locally, let's create a central location. Let's use some of your tools, whether we provision some cloud services for you and you store it over there, or we leverage the pure Visual Studio Online services. Those options are available for you to contribute in the planning phase as you start to get together and kind of define this area going forward. So there's a couple of slides, if we can just flick back to the deck. So centralized against decentralized, you'll see the kind of Microsoft one on the top left, Team Foundation version control, looking at Git, which probably via GitHub is probably the most popular open one that is out there at the moment. So if you see any of these terms, you hear any of these terms, you bump into a developer and you hear him talking about something called Git, and you wonder what is that about, at least now you can position and see that actually this sits in as a control for source code. and allow you to have a decentralized view of your code that's been checked in as a developer. But digging one level deeper, if we flick across to the next slide, we now start to get well, you get my face over the table as well, but you now get a full view of exactly what is good and bad, or what are the pros and cons across those. Now, as an IT pro, you're not able to provide any value into a discussion about which one to use if you don't understand the basics around those. And so ideally, in the next few slides, we'll build out the basics around source control, explain what that's about, kind of generic to what you are using as source control, but to give you a view of what it's actually doing and why it's important. Because as you move through the phases of building into release, you need to understand how you can add value as an IT pro to not only assisting with locations for version control, but also possibly securing and looking after and auditing who accesses, who uses in a central location for the operations side down the line. I mean, there's a nice, real good list of TFS and VSO, a comparison of them. Now, TFS purely on-premises, slight overlap with a leap to public cloud in certain cases. Sometimes a bit of manual intervention is required for you to actually start talking out to Azure. But if you're looking for a purely cloud service only, then Visual Studio Online is what it's going to be. And similar to all our other cloud offerings, that is the one that'll get the faster iteration of updates. That is the same as Office 365, same as Azure, etc. You will see more updates, more features coming either every month, every week, depending on what the call is from the field. Okay, Dave, maybe I can hand over to you around the familiarity of the source code repository.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Again, it's generic, not focusing on anyone in particular.
Yeah, and so just to kind of have a high-level recap on why should a ops guy or an IT pro care about source code control. I mean, you're going to be interacting, as you'll see as we go through the course of the day, with the source code itself, not like as in you're coding it, but more of like you're using that source code to do builds and deployments in an automated fashion, right? So you need to know how to interact with that source code control. Not necessarily you're not doing any coding, right? We don't. That's a developer's job, right? But in this case, right, you've got somebody who has, let's say, a Visual Studio client, and that Visual Studio client is then going to connect up to your source code repository. Now, in this particular case, right, the source code repository is going to have a number of different branches in that list, right? In this case, we have, let's say, main. Some people call that the trunk branch, and under that, people can have, in development teams, companies can have all different kinds of structures or branches of where they check in code, right? But eventually, that code has to be surfaced up into a repository that then gets as kind of the source of truth that then gets deployed out to your application in your environment, right? So going into the differences of structures and all of that is really far beyond the scope of this conversation, and I would say really that's going to be something that your development team is going to have a heavy input into. You really don't need to care so much about that, but just realize that there's different branches, and then source code is going to be checked into all these different branches, right? You just need to know how to interact with wherever that source code is at so that you can do your deployments and do different things to push that out into your environment, right?
And the other piece is if they do stick to that structure, it does help a bit later when it comes to release and operations from a security perspective, auditing, logging, because it goes back to the original discussion around you've affected my infrastructure, no, your app's the problem. Let's see exactly what happened. So if we do have a central repository, central source of truth, we're able to actually gauge and see exactly what has happened when there's been an impact or a failure that we're looking after.
Yep. Okay. So that kind of, is a high-level quick overview of source code repositories. Now, within Visual Studio Online or Team Foundation Server, we support TFVC or Team Foundation Version Control or Git. You can use either of those versions in either of our products there. So what is a build? And this is something that is probably a new concept to most operations or IT pro folks. You may have heard of the term, but what really is it, right? Well, in this case, right, we have let's say a developer who goes in, checks in a piece of source code, and then does a build, right? That build essentially is doing a test to say, making sure that code compiles, right? It passes some level of bar of quality where the code itself compiles, it doesn't throw up any errors, and then, if there's no errors, and if you do have some automated tests or things attached to that build process, you now have this kind of blessed view of, okay, this build package from this version of source control, we know that has some level of quality or it works, right? And so you can go ahead and deploy, the code directly to the locations, but that's not wise because you're not really sure if that source code is going to work or not, right? So that application is going to compile, create that build package. This is one way you could do it where a developer manually goes into the source code control and says, hey, I want to make a build. There's other ways, though, to also make builds. And one of the next ways is to, let's say, script that build to happen, right? So you actually would go in and say, hey, I'm going to run this command or this script against the source code repository and say, hey, execute a build on this version of this branch of that source code. That's a second way to do it. Another way to do it, and this is really when you start to get into continuous deployment, continuous integration, and we'll explain that more as we go through the course of the day, right? Where you have, when somebody checks in a piece of code, you can automatically fire off a build, and in this case, release management for Visual Studio would do that, right? It would connect up to your source code repository. It would then automatically, when somebody checks in that code based on the rules that you specify, then automatically create that build inside of that environment, right? Now that build, it could live in a number of different places. Typically, that's going to live on, in Visual Studio Online's case, it would live in Visual Studio Online. Some cases, the build lives on the client machine if they do a local build, right? But if you're using that source code control, you're probably going to be having that build exist in Team Foundation Server or Visual Studio Online. Another way that builds can be executed, and we'll talk again a little more about how this works later, is through Microsoft Azure. Microsoft Azure can, when you check in code, if you set up that continuous integration and deployment, when you check in that code, it will then automatically create a build and potentially also do that deployment for you. So really high-level view here on what builds is and some of the ways that builds can be executed, just to give you kind of a rough idea of what that's like. Because ideally, right, you're going to do your deployments based on the build and not just some arbitrary, wherever this is in source code. Okay. So I'll fire off back to you now.
Cool, we'll get that deck back up again for us. Have a look at. So now let's take what David has positioned around source code repository, around builds, the definition of builds, and exactly what is happening from an interaction perspective. And we're now going to step into the kind of first on-premises section. So taking that framework that we had for the phases, understand the products that we've got tied in together, what are we actually achieving? But we want to show it from the developer's perspective. He needs to use the tools that he is comfortable with, the tools he uses on a day-to-day basis. We don't want to go and give him extra consoles that we've developed or using as IT operations and allow him now to start using those which he's not familiar with, etc., etc. He must have his native tools, but access the infrastructure and have the ability to automate as much as possible from a self-service perspective, leveraging the investment in the infrastructure that the business has made. From a product integration perspective, we're going to have a look at the configuration between Team Foundation Server as well as System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Understanding that once the integration is done, I can leverage the artifacts that I have stored within my library as well as the configuration that I have on my project sides to allow self-service for my developers with VMM providing the backbone from an infrastructure perspective. Once we're finished with that, we'll have a quick look to see the differences from a role-based access control. So if I implement RBAC, role-based access control, how do I then define which developers have access to which components? So as operations, I get to control who uses which resources, which artifacts I've stored in the library, which clouds I could possibly use within Virtual Machine Manager, and possibly assign quota points to them on the other side as well. So if we really were working in a proper chargeback or showback model, we can get very granular around those pieces. Now, to get to those first 2 points and have all those pieces kind of nailed down as far as artifacts, role-based access control, who needs what, who uses what, we need to start again right in the beginning in the planning phase. As an IT pro, understand from the developers what kind of templates does he want, what servers does he want, what versions of the OS, what roles, what features. Within those features, which capabilities does he want, what versions of .NET, what authentication. Little things like that go a long way to allow the full self-service automation piece if we can build up those artifacts for him ahead of time and store them in the library. So what we're going to do is we'll have a look at those pieces, how they tie together, and then we will understand from an integration perspective what the developer's experience is like. Once that's finished, I'll take you through a quick step through the 3 different consoles. I think it's my data center that fell down the back, but we will log in and see if it is still there in a few minutes. Okay. That was a data center that fell the back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We digress. If I can't log in, it was a data center. If I can, it's quite a robust private cloud that we have running behind us here. But ideally, I'll take you through the consoles, take you through the look and feel from a developer's perspective, and then a quick close off to show you from an operations perspective what you need to have in place. So if we jump across to my screen on the other side, yes, my RDP is still working, so my data center hasn't quite crashed. I'll just move my wheel off it over here at the moment. Anyway, so we're going to go through a couple of consoles. The first one being the Microsoft Test Manager, which is a component within Visual Studio from Ultimate that can be used to allow developers to build out their own environments in a lab infrastructure, as well as create and run out test plans either against those environments or in different scenarios. So just to kind of keep it at a high level. So if we have a look at this console that I have up here, I want to focus on two areas, the lab and the library. From a library perspective, this is where the developer starts to build his environments. He gets to store his environments that either he can repeatedly use as he has new iterations of a particular application coming out, or he can build up, use, test, and destroy and throw away, depending on what the scenario is. But the key takeaway of this little demo within this console is I have one location that I come to, I build, I run my tests, and then I decide later on where the path is going to be down a little bit further on. So if we start with the first piece and we look at the library tab over here, you'll see I have a couple of templates that are assigned and available for me to use already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a quick 30-second wizard to show you how to import those templates and what they basically are doing to enable the developers from a self-service perspective. If I click on import, the first question that it kind of asked me straight away is, what template do you want from Virtual Machine Manager? And the only reason I can see that question is because I've done the integration between TFS and between Virtual Machine Manager. So if I didn't have that, I would only be able to build and deploy standard environments, which are physical virtual machines or virtual ones that I use from an FQDN target perspective. So if I click on Browse, I then get to have a look at Virtual Machine Manager to get a view of what templates are available to me. Again, depending on my data center that rocked behind me a few seconds ago. But ideally in this location over here now, I should get a view of the templates in my library that are available to me as a developer. I'm logged in as Morgan, the administrator. I'm not logged in as a standard developer. So I get to see development templates as well as production templates. So for example, yes, due to my OCD naming conventions, quite differentiators between dev and prod, as well as what is inside of those images. Because as a developer logging in now, I look at that template and I go, wow, that's what I want. I want Windows Server 2012 R2. I want IIS 8. I want .NET 2.5, 3.5. And yes, I need SQL as well because I'm doing a quick test on my Fabricam Fiber website. So I can select that one and say add. It'll give me some components that are pre-populated. But the key one at the bottom is the default role. Selecting that role now, I mean, we can just call it generic server in this case, but that role is important if I want to target later when I run through the creation or the editing of my build definition. If we say next, we'll get a full view of exactly how this is configured and set up. You'll notice that it's actually all kind of grayed out. I'm not able to use it because I've defined everything within my templates, within my library in Virtual Machine Manager. So yes, self-service for the developer, but control and restriction for operations for them using a prescribed set. And again, you can do a simple thing like just ensure your MSDN license keys are the keys sitting in the templates. So no breaching of your volume licensing agreements. Small little things like that, just to ensure that we have some consistency. If we jump back to the demo screen, and if we had to clean this off now and be finished with it, this allows the developer to have a view of what really is this makeup going to be of my environment before I deploy this out. One final review, yes, I'm happy with that. That's the domain I'm going to join. In this case, the demo.local. Happy with the resources, great. Now I can add multiple ones in here. From a demo perspective now, I've just added one in, but I can have multiple. I can have front-facing websites. I can have clients, various operating systems on those clients. I can have back-end database servers. But together, that is my application that I need to run my targeted tests out against. So if we click onto the last step, it'll kind of do a finish. And right, simple as that, it's imported, it's available for me to use. Now, how would I use that? I'd go back to the lab tab, I'd say create me a new environment, and I now step to the question of building out that environment. An environment is a logical container of servers that are in there. And then I target those servers with my relevant build definitions for the code that I want to run against them. And really, it's a matter of just giving them a name. So we can just do MVA Jumpstart as an example. Say next. The question then really is, what do you want to import from a template perspective? Well, I want one client, I want one server, and I want one base server. Add to my environment. I now have them on the right-hand side. I can get a little bit cleverer if I want, and I can start to rename this from a naming convention perspective, but that's just the machine name. That's not the FQDN or the DNS name that you would have in this demo.local domain that we're deploying to at the moment. And say next, I get a full view again of what is my environment and what is each one made up of from a resourcing perspective and configuration perspective. If I wanted to, I could enable network isolation. So really allowing me to build out an environment isolated from my production environment using Hyper-V from a virtual network card perspective, and allowing me to run tests against machines as close as possible to simulate what I have in production. Jump to the last step and kind of do a verify, make sure it's happy, and once it's completed, I can deploy that environment. All that's going to happen is that Virtual Machine Manager is going to kick off a job, it's going to build all those VMs for me. When it's completed, I can come back in and do exactly what I need to do. The downside is my host that seems to rock behind me is no longer available. So I'll just need to check that the network cable is still plugged into it. But I think the key takeaway is the ability for a developer to use this tool, use this console, and provision self-service everything he needs to on the other side. The last piece to this really is, right, I've got my environment, it's available for me to use. Just cancel out and move 1 second back. So as an example, I have a few environments that are sitting up here made up of a couple of virtual machines on the right-hand side. How would I use these? From Visual Studio's perspective, I would log into Visual Studio, I'd have a look at my build definitions that are available to me, and in this case I'm just going to edit the build definition, and all that I'm doing is I'm setting up controls, I'm setting up configuration scripts to target how do I want this build to roll out, and what piece should run where on what in that particular environment. The key piece I want to focus on really is on the Process tab itself. So in the Process tab, I get to focus now and have a look back at my environments from a Microsoft Test Manager perspective. I can step through a couple of quick questions within the wizard. Which one do you want to access? And if we have a look, that's exactly the ones we wanted to use from a resourcing perspective from the environments. Say next. I can just give a quick dummy location here. Say next. And this is the piece that's really important. So over here now, the developer can decide to say, well, I actually want to select and deploy based on roles or based on server names. If I say roles and I add in a role, I get to see the roles that are available to me in that environment I've created. If I go back and say names, say add again, I get to go and pick the relevant names we've added. So now I can select, right, there's my database server that I want to add in, and I can try and write which script that I want to run against that database server from a testing perspective. So in the scenario, all that we've done is we've gone through two consoles. One is Microsoft Test Manager, building out the environments, deciding how those environments will look. And the other one is Visual Studio, the native tools that developers are used to. And then targeting those environments based on the actual builds that they want to run out from a testing perspective. Now in the background, to kind of close this demo off, as IT pros, you're able to provide this self-service with existing tools such as Virtual Machine Manager. Just ensuring the integration is there allows developers to actually get the benefits of using those templates and environments that you've built in the backend. And really, it is as simple as creating templates, giving them an assignment, giving them access, and saying which user or which group has access all through Active Directory. So we've created the environment, we've created the templates to provision for those environments, and we've also kind of locked down and secured, but enabled the developers to leverage our infrastructure in the backend. So it's a quick run through this process, but hopefully the key takeaways are there. We've enabled the developer for self-service, we've used our infrastructure, our system center pieces, and we're provisioning to our private cloud in this scenario that can be used from a development perspective. Cool, so if we want to jump back to the slides or on the other side over there, maybe just build those out from a quick review perspective. So this is kind of giving us a view of, we've got Team Foundation version control, we've got Team Foundation server from a management perspective, and the green block, the actual test manager, TFS, and Microsoft monitoring agent, that is where we want our developers to spend time. Spend time in Visual Studio, spend time in Microsoft Test Manager, even the environment viewer, connect, do all your tests, but then don't forget about possibly including operations to actually start to monitor. Give me a view of what's going on in my environment so that I know when I run these tests, is there failure? Is there exceptions? Is there performance problems? But we are building them all on the back of our infrastructure from a system center perspective. So the view that we have now as we click through the slides now is we use our lab environments, we run our builds, we get our test results back, fine tune based on what we see, possibly use the Microsoft monitoring agent to give us a bit of in-depth monitoring at that stage. And if we don't want to feed it back directly to the developers, we can integrate it back straight to Operations Manager, which will be residing in the back. So again, Dave, the whole thing, we provision self-service, and we've given them the ability to actually do quite a lot of end-to-end testing, just leveraging the key components that they are used to from a native tools perspective.
Okay. Right. So I want to pick up. He mentioned one concept that was there about Microsoft Monitoring Agent. Now, this relates to a concept called application performance monitoring, or APM for short. We use that acronym. So sometimes you'll hear MMA, which is the technical agent that's installed to get that feedback. But the general process or category of the thing that we're doing there is application performance monitoring. Now, this capability is enabled with that MMA agent, and it is also has the ability to be lit up on the Visual Studio Online site or on the Microsoft System Center suite, which Morgan just referenced there. This is good to think about even in this phase of the life cycle and development, because this is what's going to give you that code level feedback to if there's problems, right? So if you integrate that agent, install that agent on the development environment, you're going to then, if bugs happen or things crash, you're going to get additional capabilities to see, performance problems, see the line of code where you may have problems, right? Now, you don't have to do it at this phase, but this is, back to that point of application quality and IT guys being enabled there. You can see how, integrating that agent in and then having it cycle back to the lifecycle the development lifecycle could play a role there. Now, there is some slight capabilities that are different between the two. On the bottom part of the deck, you'll see, there's the focus and the where and the interface, right? Well, with Visual Studio Online, really the heavy focus is on doing application monitoring, right? There are no real capabilities today anywhere where we want to say, just scan all the resources inside of a subscription. I don't care if an agent's running or not, and give me data back, right? That's not really the focus of Visual Studio Online. It's really focused on the application monitoring. However, as a result of wherever you install that agent, you would get performance data on the infrastructure. On the flip side, System Center with the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, right? Its focus is really going to be monitoring all of your infrastructure and managing that infrastructure, right? With the option to add in the MMA and the APM in certain cases where you would like it to make sense, right? So a slight shift in focus, but the overlap there of application performance monitoring. And it's also a difference on where it's stored, right? With Visual Studio Online, that data is going to be stored entirely in the cloud, and you really don't need any infrastructure to have that agent roll up. Whereas obviously you're going to have to deploy that System Center infrastructure to get that code level feedback there. And then, naturally, because it's a web-based product, you're going to have to go to a web browser to see that, as opposed to, the System Center. You're going to use your System Center tools to have that come up. All right, so switching gears here into Microsoft Azure, right? Now, there are a number of different capabilities there where, you can deploy resources inside of Microsoft Azure, right? So typically, if you're going to have an application, you need some form of computing power to be there. And in the case of, let's say your application happens to be a website or a web-based property, there's quite a few choices on where you might deploy that, even within Microsoft Azure. The first here is Azure Websites, right? Azure Websites is a platform as a service offering where you're really just caring about the data and the code, right? That the app itself that goes up there. You're not really caring about the patching the operating system or managing the infrastructure, the networking, or anything like that. That's all really taken care of you from the console, right? It really makes it easy for you to deploy and get that those applications up and running. The next is cloud services, right? And it's also a platform as a service offering. And here, you have some additional capabilities over what you would have in Azure Websites, right? So if you want to have more complex multi-tiered applications with worker roles and things doing a lot of more complex tasks, you have a little more control with our cloud services to do that, right? You're going to also be able today have the APM agent as a startup task for any new instances that are run there, whereas today with Azure Websites, we don't have that capability. And then finally, you can, of course, do VMs inside of Microsoft Azure. So in the case of a website, right, what you would do there is host IIS on the server, right, or Apache or whatever you want there for the web server. But you would then really be managing the full operating system stack, right? It's your responsibility to patch it, to update it, to maintain it, right, and all of that. So it is possible, and it does allow you some additional options like DSC and Puppet and Chef, and we'll talk a little more about that to really have some additional configuration management choices. But it does come at the cost of, it is probably going to be a heavier weight. You're going to be now paying for a full-blown VM, which is generally more costly than a cloud service or an Azure website. It's also not as nimble, right? If you want to scale an actual VM, you're going to have to, scaling up is not hard, but scaling out to more instances is more hard, right? Because you're going to have to spin up new instances like from a virtual machine template, which is large. So this is kind of a rough high-level summary of, picking which option you might want to choose inside of your environment. Now, the future in my mind is really on the PaaS side of the house, and as you'll see, it really makes things a lot more agile for scaling, for infrastructure, for deployments. But again, this is really totally your choice, but it's something for you to consider.
And I hope that addresses the question we had on the chat around that piece, because it is a big story.
Yeah.
There's a lot to it.
Yep.
And we're going to drill down more and more on more defined courses for the MP.
Yeah, you'll start to see a little bit, right, of how this plays out. But definitely, we're not going to give you a depth comparison on all these things today, because I could spend a whole day talking about Microsoft Azure. And in fact, I have earlier this week. But let's go back to the slides, and we'll kind of keep going here. Morgan kind of showed you, or he showed you this test manager and kind of having templates and things, right? For on-premises, I would say that's really as close as you get to infrastructure as a code, right? It's here's a template, deploy it, right, on my on-premises site. Well, for the cloud, there's a lot of really cool options to deploy infrastructure, and really all you need is any one of these options here to do those deployments to Microsoft Azure. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, there's all these different services that Microsoft Azure has, right? And on the top is the means in which you can deploy that infrastructure. So if you were to use PowerShell, for instance, you can deploy a whole bunch of things just from the PowerShell script, right? And the XPlat CLI is another option that we have as a downloadable tool. And then WAML stands for Windows Azure Markup Language, which is a NuGet package that you would attach to Visual Studio. Resource groups, I'll talk a little about that here in a second. But that is something that's new for us that was announced at Build. And then finally, last but not least, we have integration with and good partnerships with Chef and Puppet, to where if you, as well as Vagrant, where if you want to deploy, let's say VMs, cloud services, and storage, right? You've got some options there to where directly from those open source tools you can deploy to Azure infrastructure. So what does this look like with PowerShell? If we go to this, right, we can see that from a PowerShell script. Let's say this could be on the local operations guy's machine. You could go and deploy a full-blown platform as a service website. And then ideally what you're going to do here, you don't have to, but ideally what you would do there is pull down, that script would actually pull down the build from the PowerShell code into the website. So you have, and you can say that this environment, whether it's dev test or whatever it is, actually has this specific build of the source code there, right? Now you could also, and this is what I do in this demo that we're going to show, is we actually pull that source code down from Git, right? Where we have the Git repository be the kind of source as opposed to pulling the build. So I'm going to switch over to my demo now, and what we'll do is show you kind of what this looks like, all right? So in this console, I'm logged into the Azure Management Console. Okay, and what we're going to do is deploy a new website from a PowerShell script, and we're going to connect that to the source code control. So we're going to deploy a new website, which has a SQL database, and we're going to do that all connected from source control. So here we can notice I've got 3 websites up here. I'm going to deploy a new website and SQL database that's associated with that. So if we go to our script, right? I'm really getting into the depths of the script is beyond the time that we have here today. But generally what you want to see, I'll just highlight one thing here. I've got a variable which says which location do I want to actually deploy this to. In this case, I'm going to deploy this application to the North Central US site. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and actually deploy this script. Let me go ahead and go to my location where the script is at. Give me 1 second here. And pull down this website script into my path. Now, this is the other thing that's also kind of an important thing to point out. The general trend also with DevOps is when you do these scripts that deploy the infrastructure, you ideally want to also store those with your source code control. So in my case here, I went ahead and put the script in the source code control location. If you'll notice, what I have is, this is actually a local Git repository in my case. So if I, let's see, if I do a git status, you'll notice I'm on the branch master here in this case. So, and I just added that file, so it says, hey, oh, you've got this new file there. I'm not going to worry about that now, but I just wanted to do that git command so you can see that it's a local Git repo. This could as well easily be a source code repository up online. But we'll go ahead and run our script here. It says, what's the Azure website name that you want? And I'll just call it Fabricam Fiber Demo on North Central US. Kind of a long name here, but we'll call it that. And we'll hit next. And then the client IP, this is so that the SQL script can connect up. Now this may or may not work because here where we're at, the location, even though I've done this, what's my IP address, it may be something different when the script actually runs, but we'll go ahead and try it anyway. The local website repo path is going to be where I have my source code at. So here I'm going to copy my local repo. And again, this is all just part of the script that I have, which was created. And then you'll notice it's starting to fire off here, right? It's loading up these modules. It's saying, what do you want to use for the SQL Server database account name? I'm going to type in a username and password for that. And then it says, what's the deployment credentials you want for Azure websites? I'm going to type in this. Okay. And now what it's going to do is going to start to actually deploy, you see here, creating a new Azure website called FF Demo North Central US with a Git repository. So it's taking, here's where you see, just from the script, it's connecting the website up to the source code control. So the website was created. It's now going in and creating a SQL Azure database. And the database is created. It's creating the firewall rules. And again, so we're not going to have the full app here because of the issue with the IP address. I knew this is very likely it happens on Corp. That's okay. But the point here that we want to bring up, so this right, if the IP address was correct, would actually finish the deployment, and we could still see that up here in the list. So if we go to websites and we go to our list and refresh that. Okay. Let me go to, actually it's on a different subscription here, Hybrid Test. So on Hybrid Test, this is just so you know too, you can add a live ID to multiple subscriptions, and then just going to that drop down box allows you to light those up. So in this case here, you can see I just deployed the Forefront Demo North Central US, right? That was that has to be a unique name, so you know it's real. And there, right, we even see within this deployment section that we have a local Git repository there. So it actually went and deployed that up to the Git repository. We also are seeing that it deployed a SQL database. So in this case, we had the SQL database in this list, and when it's all done, right, it goes ahead and deploys this website that's here, this Fabricam Fiber site. And so right there we've shown how with the PowerShell script, using just, PowerShell, connecting it to source code control, you deploy Microsoft Azure applications, and then that script would really kind of be your infrastructure as a code option inside of your environment. So let's kind of keep going here with the next slide. One of the concepts that I want to explain is Azure Resource Management, because here you've seen, right, how we did use PowerShell. Really, the future of our platform is going to be using this concept of Azure Resource Management, and in this case, what we have at the bottom is provider REST points. And we say provider REST points, that is really all of the Azure services. Now today, as you saw in the previous slide, it really only offers a small number of those services, right? But down the road, right, eventually you will have every single Microsoft service available under this model. And what it enables you to do is have a JSON script template or a resource group a collection of resources, and then using that JSON template or resource template to then deploy those set of infrastructure resources, right? So in this particular case, right, we would have a centralized way across and eventually, you know, cloud and all this Cloud OS story, right, where you can have a standardized set of templates to deploy that infrastructure to Azure or to wherever else you'd really like. The way that works practically is that you would have a PowerShell script, which then specifies the creation of a new resource group and other parameters using your template, your JSON template file. That would then go ahead and deploy that infrastructure up to Microsoft Azure. So here, right, and you'll kind of see this a little bit when we go into the demo in the release section. So you kind of have a better concept of what it looks like. But that the idea is that you have a better way to logically group resources. As you saw in the management console when I did my deployment there, it just had it just had like a SQL database, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's there, but I didn't really have a logical view of what that application was composed of, right? I mean, I had to know and see the linkage between the SQL database and the website, right? I had to know that was there, whereas a resource group will really help you to say, oh, this is my app. It has all this stuff and it's all connected. Okay, let's go to the hybrid scenarios here on the slides. This is, again, really super simplified, but with Microsoft Test Manager, right, you would have the ability then to use Microsoft Azure for that.
100%. I mean, when I showed you within the build definition and I had the lab management template, it allowed me to look at my environments on the lab management side. I could obviously use custom, or I could use an Azure continuous delivery template and allow me to push out and use some of the Azure services you might already have provisioned on the other side. So again, developer using the tools he knows, but at the same time provisioning across multiple locations, whether it be private or whether it be public or both at the end of the day.
Cool. And then also here, right, with the Visual Studio Client, you can create load tests, for instance. And, with load testing, it becomes really hard to have that full-blown test infrastructure, right, to spin up a whole ton of VMs, right? Let's say you want to put a massive load on your application. Well, having and just acquiring all of the infrastructure and configuring all that infrastructure to make that happen is sometimes a challenge. So we've enabled the scenario where that Visual Studio Client can run tests from the Microsoft Azure resources, and that does connect up with Visual Studio Online. Really enables you an infinite capability to put any kind of load you want on your application in a way which has very minimal effort for you to connect up to the cloud and say, I want 1,000 or 500 machines to do agents to deploy stuff, and really helps people with that hybrid story there.
And I think it's very key to understand that there's so many tools available. It's just, where do I fit them in?
Right.
And so the takeaway of these slides, again, is I can understand the processes. Let me see which tools can slot in, which ones I can use where, which ones do I own, which ones don't I own, what licensing model do I have, and then work on a strategy going forward. And I think we click across to the last slide for today's session. Again, we kind of finish off each piece around what else can ops do within this process. Now, we've spoken about repositories, we've spoken about build environments. We need to understand as operations or IT professionals within the operations team, you have a function to play in provisioning this infrastructure. You can still decide which infrastructure gets used, where it sits, how it gets used, but you've got to start offering the self-service capabilities to developers. As soon as you start to offer self-service, you get buy-in from developers. That allows an interaction. That allows the DevOps process to start, that interaction between the two. When those two start to interact, business has a benefit. Business looks at a return being gained from their investment and will possibly return some more down the line. So as a takeaway, a couple of things to look at. Firstly, how do I build environments for my developers on-premise, public cloud? If we just jump back to the slide deck again.
Yeah. And how do you interact with those, right?
Exactly.
I mean, how do I know, how do I pull down the source code using Git? Or how do I use TFS to connect up to the repo, right? I don't need to do much with it other than maybe maintain my script that's in there from a code level perspective, if you do that. But how do I interact there? And then also advanced infrastructure, right? And we haven't talked about this. We'll mention this when we get later down the list to the operate section. But there's things that really you need to know even in this development phase. Like, do you want to have advanced capabilities like automatically scaling your infrastructure using Traffic Manager to have a global availability and performance, right? Do you want to have A/B testing and things like that down the road? Even with something even as specific as Service Gateway, it's going to even require a code level thought at this stage of the game, to where, you know, if they want to do that, you need to engage at this point. And again, I'll talk more about what those are later.
And I think the other piece to take into this is that the last piece, for optimizing costs, that gives a real view back to the business of what's going on. And traditionally, who understands the infrastructure that's out there that's being used? It's operations. So developers might like to try and work out the cost for rolling out applications, different stages, different phases, etc. But at the end of the day, operations know what is going on the nuts and bolts side, and understand the cost and the investment that's been made. So leveraging that information and playing it back to the development team, playing it back to business, gives them a real world view of why I'd want to automate and use these different components to actually build out and start deploying and moving towards that release phase of releasing code through the stages into production.
Yeah, most definitely. So,
cool.
Yeah.
I don't see any.
I don't see any. Yeah, I don't see any active questions right now. But you know, definitely, you know, again, this is the hitting on that point. Be involved through every single stage of the life cycle. We're going to go ahead and now break for lunch, and with that, come back to us and check out the release section next.
In about an hour.
In about an hour. Yeah.